I'm going to do like kind of something a bit autumnal. It is September, it is my season. So I'm going to take the Modern Renaissance palette, which is kind of apropos because this is kind of the Renaissance era for weather. Hi, my name is EK and welcome to my channel Explain, giving you the too long didn't read of the too long didn't read of history. Today I want to talk about the only Maggie T from history that I respect, and that is Margaret Tudor, an English princess and the Queen of Scots. So Margaret Tudor was born in 1489. She was the eldest daughter of King Henry VII of England and his Queen Consort Elizabeth of York. Henry had won at the Battle of Bosworth, which was the last pitched battle of the Wars of the Roses, and he won that in 1485, and as a result of his win, he became the first Tudor King of England. Margaret, her two brothers and her one younger sister were kind of like the first generation of like Tudor royalty, Tudor royal princes and princesses, and as a result they required quite prestigious marriages, both to kind of reflect their royal status and also to make alliances with other countries. So the eldest child, Arthur, is engaged to the Infanta of Spain, Catalina, or as we know her, Catherine of Aragon, and they are betrothed when both Arthur and Catherine are children. Margaret becomes betrothed to the King of Scotland, who is called James Stuart, and he's ruling as James IV, and he has been ruling since 1488. James IV's parents were James III of Scotland, and his mother was a woman called Margaret, Margaret of Denmark. So James III was not a very popular king, and his reign actually ended in a coup d'etat. Some of his nobles in Scotland basically rebelled against him and said that they wanted the young James IV, Prince James as he was then, they wanted him to be king instead. The kind of reasons for this coup are quite complicated and they're not like super relevant to today's story, but the important bits that you do need to know is that there was a coup. James III died after a battle. The details around like James III's death are kind of up for debate, but that is a very bizarre and like macabre but probably apocryphal story that after this battle he was injured and he was kind of seeking help, and he went to like a rural like peasant woman and was like, help, you know, like, could you fetch me a priest? And so she disappears, comes back with this man, and the man says, yeah, here's your priest, and then stabs him. So probably didn't happen, but you know, just kind of like a fun little weird bit of trivia. Not fun for him, obviously. But James III had been pursuing an alliance with England, which is kind of partly why some of his nobles didn't like him, and James IV, who was considered a much better king, continued this policy of an alliance with England, and these are the circumstances that led to the marriage between James IV and Margaret Tudor. So this marriage was designed to underscore the Treaty of Perpetual Peace, which both the kings hoped would put a stop to the kind of incessant outbreaks of conflict that took place between the two countries. In addition, Henry VII said that this treaty and this marriage would never lead to a king of Scotland inheriting the crown of England, and within 100 years he would be proven wrong. You know, he would be dead within 100 years though, so like he wasn't there, but he was proven wrong. So in 1503, Margaret at the age of 13 heads north to Scotland to take her place as queen, and between 1507 and 1513 she has 3 children, but unfortunately only one of them survives, and he is a son named James. And by the summer of 1513 Margaret is pregnant again, her 4th pregnancy. So in terms of a royal couple, Margaret and James are doing quite well, so they've got their heir, they are working on the spare, and Margaret is kind of fulfilling her familial duty by bringing peace to these 2 royal families and to these 2 countries. But if you remember from my last video, A Vague History of England Part 2, when I mentioned Margaret and the Treaty of Perpetual Peace, I said that the only way this treaty could be seen as successful is if you define perpetuity as about 10 years. And if you are doing the maths, which I almost never am, you may have worked out that 1513 is a decade after 1503 when the treaty was signed, and indeed in 1513 Scotland and England are once again preparing to go to war. So the roots of this conflict, and indeed the roots of almost all of Scotland's foreign policy decisions, can be traced back to the 1290s, specifically 1296. At this time, if you remember from my first Vague History of England video, Scotland had run out of kings, and its first alternate, Margaret of Norway, had died on her way to coming to Scotland to take her place as queen. So Scotland, knowing that Edward I of England was going to be out to his usual shenanigans, turned to the continent for help, specifically France. And in 1296, a policy of mutual assistance was agreed between the two countries, and this came to be known as the Old Alliance. And the rules basically were that if one of them went to war with England, the other one would back them. There were lapses in this alliance, but overall it did kind of hold until about 1560, and even after 1560, the kind of echoes of it remained influential in Scottish politics. So in 1513, Henry VIII of England, who is Margaret's younger brother, and he had become king in 1509, he decides he wants to go to war with King Francois I of France. Francois turns to their ally Scotland and says, you know, you better put up or shut up, and James IV chooses the former and prepares to invade England on behalf of France. So Margaret kind of says, like, you know, please don't do this, please don't invade England, I don't want you to go to war with my brother, I think this is a really bad idea. And she is right, it is a really bad idea, because at the Battle of Flodden in 1513, almost an entire generation of Scots nobility is wiped out, and that includes James IV, whose body was taken south to London. Now, at the time of the battle, Henry VIII was actually in France fighting, so his wife, Catherine of Aragon, who originally was betrothed and married to his older brother, that's going to be a whole other video. Anyway, Catherine of Aragon is acting as regent, and she is kind of commanding what is happening at the Battle of Flodden. Now, according to some sources, Catherine wanted to send the head of James IV of Scotland to her husband in France as a trophy, but some of the English courtiers were like, maybe don't do that, that's a bit weird. So instead she settled for sending the blood-soaked jacket of James IV to her husband, which, I mean, it's still kind of weird, but you know, you do you, Catherine. So the death of James IV leaves Margaret as the Dowager Queen of France. It obviously does not leave her as the Dowager Queen of France, it leaves her as the Dowager Queen of Scotland. On the 21st of September 1513, her eldest son James is hastily crowned at Stirling Castle as James V, and in April of 1514, Margaret gives birth to another son who is named Alexander. James IV had actually left arrangements for Margaret to be regent for their son James in the event that he died, but these arrangements only stood if Margaret remained unmarried, which she did not. So the subsequent pathway of Margaret's life, and also that of her sons really, depended on two factors. So number one is that Henry VIII had no male heirs, and thus his nephew, James V, as a grandson of Henry VII, was the closest male heir to the throne. And the second factor is that Margaret Tudor, although the Queen of Scots and the mother of the Scottish king, Margaret was born an English princess, and as a result she was expected to act as an ambassador for her brother's interests in Scotland, chiefly in opposition to French interests in Scotland. As I said earlier, the Old Alliance really was pivotal to Scottish history, and all of the Stuart kings of Scotland had ruled in the middle of these two much wealthier and often bickering nations. And sometimes that kind of worked to Scotland's advantage because it was able to kind of like play one off against the other, but sometimes it was a complete disaster, and Flodden was not the first example of that. In 1346, King David II of Scotland, who was the son of Robert the Bruce, he had actually been taken captive by the English when invading England on behalf of France. So how does Margaret's... I know there's more in there. I know there is more in there, because last time when I thought it was empty, it then exploded. We could be here a while. Oh, yes! Told you there was more in there. Right, what the fuck was I talking about? Oh yeah. So how does Margaret's widowhood play out? We do know that in the late medieval and early modern period, a woman's widowhood could be a really good time for her. She had more independence, she had more like economic agency and often access to more resources, and there are cases of widows doing really well for themselves and kind of living their best lives. But for Margaret, well, I mean, when you look at Margaret Tudor, you kind of just look at her story and you think, I wish you had made better choices. And her first kind of terrible, and probably like her worst decision that she makes comes not too far after the death of her husband, and that is in 1514 when she remarries. And she remarries a Scottish nobleman called Archibald Douglas, and he is the 6th Earl of Angus. So, like, to keep things simple, I will just refer to him as Angus. So Angus is part of a family called the Douglases, and there are actually 2 branches of the Douglas family. There is the Black Douglases and the Red Douglases, and he is a Red Douglas. The Black Douglases are actually the Earls of Douglas. It's very confusing, and it was probably more confusing at the time because you didn't have Google to just like look it up whenever you got confused, and you probably couldn't read. But the point is, Angus is a Red Douglas, and he is the head of the Red Douglas branch of the family. His father had died at Flodden, and then a month later his grandfather, who had been the 5th Earl of Angus, died just of death. So Margaret kind of marrying the head of one of Scotland's noble families was kind of always going to be controversial. At this point in history, Scotland's politics and court was very factional. Very often they had minority kings, so like kings that weren't old enough to rule, and so they would be ruled by regents. Because they were ruled by regents, it meant that factions could kind of coalesce around different figures within the court, and it was really unstable. Oh, I just poked myself on the eye. So even if Angus had been a really good husband and maybe like a really good stepfather to the king, the fact that his family were kind of getting primacy as a result of this marriage to the Dowager Queen and Queen Regent was never really going to sit well with other nobles and other courtiers. And compounding this is the fact that Angus was not a very nice husband and not a very good stepfather to the king. He is, to put not too fine a point on it, a duplicitous little shit. But as I said, even if he wasn't, people still would have been kind of pissed about it. So some of the nobles in Scotland decide they want a new regent. They don't want Margaret to be the regent for her son anymore. And to find this new regent, they look to France. And in France, they find a cousin. He is the first cousin once removed of James V. And he is called John Stuart, and he is the Duke of Albany. John's father was the brother of James III. He was called Alexander, and he ended up exiled in France for trying to kind of take the throne of his brother James III. And in 1482 he had a son called John, and then 3 years later he dies in a jousting accident. So Alexander's death makes John the Duke of Albany, and he is living in France at the time, but he agrees to come over and take on the role of regent. Albany and like his allies are kind of representing the pro-French interests in Scotland, and then Margaret, Angus and kind of her allies are representing the pro-English interest in Scotland. So Margaret and Angus look to her brother Henry VIII of England and ask him for some more cash so that they can kind of stage a counter coup against Albany. But Henry doesn't do that. He is interested in like furthering England's interests in Scotland, and he is also interested in preventing Albany and by extension the French interests from kind of overpowering Scotland, but he doesn't really want to like come up with any cash for it. He doesn't want to commit any resources to help his sister, while Albany is working to kind of cement the old alliance once more with France and Scotland. As part of Albany's kind of like seizure of power, Margaret's 2 sons, so James V and then Alexander, her youngest son, are taken from her. There is a standoff at Stirling Castle, and her 2 sons are taken into Albany's custody, and Margaret escapes while heavily pregnant with her first child with Angus. She escapes to England, and she makes it over the border just in time to give birth to her first child with Angus, and that is a daughter called Margaret, who I will call Margaret Douglas to differentiate her from her own mother. Margaret's health after giving birth to her daughter is quite frail, so she very slowly makes her way south to London to visit her brother, while Angus returns to Scotland ostensibly to defend his interests and like his how many times am I going to fucking say interests in this video? I think it's going to be a lot. What is he defending? His interests. Nope, someone else. It just says interests. Basically to defend like his land and his properties, etc. Against Albany, who is like now in charge. Basically, Angus stays in Scotland while Margaret goes down to London. That's all you need to know. Margaret stays in London for about a year at the court of her brother, and while she is there, Henry VIII is pressuring Francois of France to recall Albany back to France and kind of get him out of Scotland so that Margaret can kind of return to power. And eventually that does happen, and in the summer of 1517 Margaret returns to Scotland. Albany is back in France by this point, but Margaret is not made regent. Although Margaret is reunited with her husband, with Angus, she is very upset to learn that he has been living with his mistress, a woman called Janet, and that they have actually had a child while she's been away. Margaret's youngest son, Alexander, had actually died while she was in England, and she isn't actually allowed to spend much time with her eldest son, with James the King, because a lot of the Scots nobility are worried that she will spirit him away to England. So overall, it's kind of a miserable existence for our Tudor princess. And as a result of this misery, Margaret decides to defect. She decides she's going to kind of take her luck with Albany and with the French, and she begins to try and get Albany back from France in the hopes that he might treat her a little better. She is, after all, a princess. She's the Dowager Queen of Scotland and the former Queen Regent of Scotland, and at this point she has no power, she has no resources, she's not allowed to spend a lot of time with her son, and she has a pathetic excuse for a husband. Henry VIII of England, unsurprisingly, is furious about this, and it completely compromises his interests in Scotland. Henry tries to get Margaret to reconcile with her husband, with Angus, but in true Tudor fashion, she instead seeks a divorce on the basis that he has not been faithful and that he may have actually been pre-contracted to marry this Janet woman who he has now been living with as his mistress, that they might actually have been betrothed to marry before Margaret and Angus got married. In 1521, Margaret's prayers are answered and Albany does return to Scotland. Albany does kind of help out Margaret, which naturally leads to rumours that she is his mistress, and these rumours are kind of compounded by the fact that Albany banishes Angus from Scotland. But I highly doubt he did that because he was shagging Margaret Tudor, and probably had more to do with the fact that Angus was very clearly in the pocket of England. But you know, whatever helped Henry VIII sleep at night. In 1522, with the old alliance between Scotland and France back on, Albany prepares to invade England for France. I just had to pause for like 5 minutes because oh yeah, my camera overheated, and I was going to kind of leave it a bit longer, but A, I think it's cooled down, and B, it's getting dark outside, so I've actually put on my light. Yes, I have lights. I am a proper YouTuber now. A very good friend gave them to me, gifted them to me as a congratulations for graduating, which I have just done. And the same friend is the person who actually gave me this camera. So thank you, you know who you are, and I am very grateful for all your support and encouragement. And yeah, without you I wouldn't have the channel, so wow, it's soppy. Like, I am still in front of the daylight, but then I've got this lamp on very low so that it's not like too dark, because it's now September, aka the best month in the world, aka my birthday month, aka Virgo season, so it's a bit dark, like it's really rainy and miserable. So anyway, Albany was just about to invade England. Wow, I really left myself on a cliffhanger then. Henry VII has kind of fallen out with France. They were kind of trying to be allies for a bit, but then they've fallen out again. So the old alliance is once more invoked, and Albany is like, I'm there, don't worry Francois, I'm coming, I'm gonna invade England. But unfortunately for Albany and for France, Margaret decides to betray her new ally and kind of defect again back to the pro-English side. This time with a Scottish noble called James Hamilton, who is the Earl of Arran and is also like a relative, a cousin of James V. So Albany's invasion fails and he returns to France in disgust. But Margaret and her new best friend Arran invest James V the symbols of sovereignty. He's 12 years old, so he's not old enough to rule without a regent, but this is kind of part of that transition slowly through his adolescence, where he will eventually be taking power for himself. And finally, Margaret is allowed to see her son and to spend more time with him. Henry VIII makes James V, his nephew, a Knight of the Garter, and there is talk about a marriage between James V and his first cousin, Mary Tudor, who is the only surviving child of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. This return to the pro-English faction puts Margaret at odds with a lot of the other Scottish nobles who are more interested in preserving the old alliance with France, not least because Francois of France has just been captured by the Holy Roman Emperor in battle, and everyone's kind of feeling a bit sorry for him at this point. But despite Margaret's return to the pro-English side, she refuses to reconcile with her husband, with Angus, and because Angus is being funded by her brother Henry VIII to drive a wedge between Scotland and France, this leads to Henry abandoning all kind of pretense of support for his sister, not that he was much use to her anyway. Now, when Albany returned to France in 1524 after Margaret had betrayed him, he had left arrangements for Scotland to be governed by a rotating council of regents, and this was designed to prevent any one faction from getting the upper hand for too long. Unfortunately, this Regency Council includes Angus, and when it is Angus's time to give up custody of the king, he refuses and instead begins to kind of entrench his dominance of royal government. At the same time, Margaret defects again, again. So originally she was on the English side.
Then she was hanging out with Albany, then she betrayed Albany to go back to England, but wouldn't reconcile with her husband, and now she is going back to the French side.
The Earl of Arran joins her on this defection, and they are now supporting France's interests. She also manages to obtain an annulment of her marriage with Angus on the basis that he was married or betrothed to this Janet woman before they were married. Margaret then remarries again to another distant relative of the king, and just when you thought things were settling down in 1528, everything changes again, because James V escapes from his stepfather's or former stepfather's clutches and makes it to Stirling Castle. So James V finally takes control of the Scottish throne. He expels his stepfather Angus and makes his new stepfather Henry Stuart the first Lord Methven. I think it's pronounced Methven. I'm about to go and live in Scotland, so hopefully my pronunciation of these names etc. will get better. When you study mainly online, you don't hear things aloud a lot, you're always reading it, so although I will always try and pronounce things correctly, there is obviously always room for error. So after this, Margaret kind of takes a lesser role in royal government, and it's probably for the best. She's 39 at this point, and she has been involved in Scottish politics since she was 13, so you know, the woman might need a rest. She does once again return to favouring an Anglo-Scottish alliance over a French one, and in 1536 she also tries to intervene in English politics on behalf of her daughter Margaret Douglas, who had incurred the wrath of her uncle Henry VIII. So Margaret Douglas had lived most of her life at the English court, and she had spent a lot of that time just a couple of heartbeats away from the English crown after her half-brother, and at various points Henry's two daughters, so Mary and Elizabeth, were both disinherited and then re-inherited and then disinherited a lot. So at some points Margaret Douglas was higher in the line of succession, and at some point she was slightly lower. So when in 1535 Margaret becomes secretly engaged to a nobleman called Lord Thomas Howard, it's kind of a big deal because she could one day be queen. Thomas was the uncle of Queen Anne Boleyn, and by the time Henry discovered that Margaret Douglas was married to Thomas, Anne had already been executed a few months prior. As a result, Henry was furious and he imprisoned both of them. Margaret is eventually released, but Thomas unfortunately dies in custody. In 1537, Henry VIII's first son is born, the son he has wanted for so long, by his third wife, Queen Jane Seymour, and as a result that means Margaret Douglas kind of goes back down the succession and therefore is allowed a little more breathing space and kind of returns to her uncle's favour. I don't know if Margaret Douglas's release after the Howard affair was anything to do with her mother, but it is clear that Scottish politics was not being influenced by the Dowager Queen, as James V decided to seek a French bride rather than an English one. In 1538, James V marries Madeleine. She is the daughter of Francois I of France, but she unfortunately dies very shortly after they get married. For his second bride, he returns to France and marries a widow named Mary de Guise. She is the widow of the Duke de Longueville, and her family, the Guise family, are very influential. So according to the Dictionary of National Biography, Margaret kind of spends the 1530s up to her old tricks. She is begging her brother for financial support again, and she is quarrelling with her third husband Henry. Henry even claims that Margaret wants to go back to England and reconcile with her first husband Angus, who is still alive. Kind of unsurprisingly, Henry VIII didn't have much interest in supporting his sister or inviting her back to England. He probably felt that the Anglo-Scottish ship had kind of sailed for the time being, as James V chose France for both of his brides. And just as with Margaret Douglas, James V's kind of importance to his uncle had probably diminished a bit at the time when Prince Edward was born. In 1541, Margaret passes away of a stroke at the age of 51. She wanted all of her belongings to be left to her daughter, to Margaret Douglas, but James V apparently ignored his mother's wishes and took the lot for the crown. And James V only survives his mother by a year. In the autumn of 1542, he dies after another failed invasion of England under the Old Alliance. Just like his father, he leaves another infant on the throne of Scotland. But to his deathbed disappointment, this one is a girl called Mary, and she is crowned Queen of Scots at less than a week old. Henry VIII doesn't last much longer. He dies in 1547. Margaret's third husband, Henry Lord Methven, dies in 1552, leaving Angus as the last one standing, and he dies in 1557. Eventually, however, it will be the descendants of Angus and Margaret who ascend to the throne of England, bringing an end to the Tudor dynasty. And despite James V's dying prophecy that the Stuart dynasty was doomed, ushering in a new royal family that would oversee first the union of the crowns in 1603 and eventually in 1707 the creation of Great Britain under Queen Anne. Oh, that's the good shit. That is the good shit. And that is Margaret Tudor. She was a really interesting woman, and she was involved in politics at a really interesting time in both England and Scotland. So England had just wrapped up the Wars of the Roses, even though there was a little bit spillover, while Scotland was very much embroiled in French politics, as I kind of said towards the beginning. I would love to do more videos on more women in Scottish history. Obviously Mary, Queen of Scots, that insufferable nightmare and albatross of my life, that's a given. Like, you have to talk about, you can't talk about Scottish history and you can't talk about those kind of romantic ideas about Scottish history without talking about Mary, Queen of Scots. I don't know how frequent my kind of content, whether that's historical or more like makeup, chatty, whatever stuff, is going to be, because as I alluded to earlier, I'm about to move to a different country and I'm about to embark on postgraduate study. So we shall see. If you have any questions or suggestions for videos, please feel free to leave it in the comments down below. Stay safe out there, wash your hands, wear a mask, and have a good day. In 14, that's the wrong fucking century.